Marcus Chen stood at the edge of the observation deck, watching the stars drift past through the massive viewport of the Galactic Confederation flagship, Harmony. The scars that ran from his left temple down to his jaw caught the reflection of distant suns, creating a map of pain across his weathered face. Behind him, he could hear the familiar whispers and clicking sounds that meant the alien crew members were talking about him again. The Zenthari were the worst. Their tall, elegant forms moved with a grace that made every human look clumsy by comparison. Their pale blue skin never showed blemishes, never bore the marks of violence or struggle. To them, Marcus's scars were not just ugly. They were proof of human weakness, evidence that his species was too primitive to avoid injury in the first place. "Look at the damaged one," came a whisper in Zenthari. Marcus had learned enough of their language during his 3 months aboard the ship to understand the insult. How did his kind ever survive long enough to reach the stars? Marcus turned slowly, his brown eyes finding the group of Zenthari officers clustered near the tactical display. They were young ones, probably fresh from their military academies on Zenthara Prime. Their uniforms were spotless, their movements precise. Everything about them screamed perfection, superiority, breeding. Captain Zethara noticed Marcus looking and gave what might have been an apologetic gesture with her four-fingered hand. She was older than the others, more experienced, and had fought alongside humans before. She knew better than to judge based on appearance alone. "Chen," she called out, her voice carrying the musical quality all Zenthari possessed. "Join us. We're reviewing the mission parameters for tomorrow's operation." Marcus walked over, ignoring the way the younger officers subtly shifted to give him more space than necessary. It wasn't fear. Zenthari didn't fear humans. It was disgust, the way someone might step away from a diseased animal. The holographic display showed a detailed map of the HFY system, where reports had come in of Void Raider activity. The raiders were a mixed group of pirates and terrorists who had been hitting supply convoys throughout the Outer Rim for months. Intelligence suggested they had established a base somewhere in the asteroid field surrounding HFY's fourth planet. "The plan is straightforward," Captain Zethara explained, her large violet eyes focusing on the display. "We'll deploy 3 squadrons to sweep the asteroid field while the main ship provides covering fire from a safe distance. Our goal is to locate and destroy their base of operations." Lieutenant Vexan, one of the younger officers, gestured dismissively toward Marcus. "Captain, I must question the wisdom of including the human in this operation. His people lack the reflexes for proper space combat, and those marks on his face suggest he has already proven inadequate in battle." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he said nothing. He had learned that defending himself only made things worse. The Zenthari saw emotional responses as further proof of human inferiority. "The human stays," Captain Zethara said firmly. "The Confederation requires mixed species crews on all operations. Besides, Lieutenant Commander Chen has more combat experience than half the officers on this ship." "Experience at getting wounded, apparently," muttered another officer under his breath. This time Marcus did speak up. "These scars," he said quietly, running a finger along the twisted line of scar tissue on his face, "aren't from losing battles. They're from winning them." The Zenthari exchanged glances. To them, being wounded at all was a failure. Their advanced shields and armor meant most Zenthari warriors went their entire careers without suffering so much as a scratch. The idea that someone could be wounded and still claim victory was foreign to their way of thinking. "Humans," Vexan said with a sound that might have been laughter, "always making excuses for their limitations." Marcus walked to the viewport and stared out at the stars again. He thought about Earth, about the wars that had shaped his species long before they ever reached for the sky. He thought about Stalingrad, where humans had fought for months in the ruins of their own city. He thought about the Alamo, where a handful of defenders had held off thousands. He thought about every last stand, every desperate battle, every moment when his people had chosen to fight rather than surrender. The Zenthari had never faced real adversity. Their technology had always protected them. Their society had never known the kind of grinding, desperate warfare that had forged humanity in fire and blood. They looked at his scars and saw failure. Marcus knew they were marks of survival. The next morning, Marcus reported to the hangar bay where his fighter was waiting. The ship was a hybrid design built to accommodate human pilots while incorporating Zenthari technology. It looked crude compared to the sleek Zenthari fighters, with their flowing lines and perfect symmetry. Marcus's ship was all angles and armor plating, built for function rather than beauty. He was running through his pre-flight checklist when Vexon approached. The Zenthari officer was already in his flight suit, which seemed to shimmer with built-in energy shields. "Human," Vexon said, "perhaps you should reconsider participating in today's mission. The asteroid field will be dangerous, and your reflexes will be fine," Marcus interrupted. "I've flown through worse." Vexon's expression shifted to something approaching pity. "I'm sure you believe that. But this is real combat, not some primitive Earth conflict. The Raiders have military-grade weapons and ships. They won't be impressed by whatever savage fighting techniques your people used on your backward planet." Marcus climbed into his cockpit without responding. As he sealed the canopy and began startup procedures, he could hear the other pilots chatting over the comm system. They spoke in Zenthari, probably assuming he couldn't understand them well enough to follow their conversation. "The human will probably panic at the first sign of real danger," one of them was saying. "If he's lucky, he'll just get himself killed without compromising the mission," another replied. "I heard humans actually feel fear before battle. Can you imagine? How did such weak creatures ever survive on their planet?" Marcus switched to a private channel with Captain Zethara. "Captain, this is Chen. Ready for departure." "Chen," came the captain's voice. "Ignore what the others say. I've read your file. I know what you did during the Martian Rebellion." Marcus was surprised. Few aliens had bothered to learn about human military history. "You've studied our conflicts?" "Some of us have. Your people, you fight differently than we do. The Zenthari way of war is about overwhelming force and superior technology. We win because we're better equipped and better trained. But humans win because you refuse to quit." The hangar doors opened, and the squadron began to launch. Marcus guided his fighter out into space, taking his position in the formation as they headed toward the Kethval system. The asteroid field loomed ahead of them, a vast maze of spinning rock and ice that could hide 1,000 ships. "All units, this is Zethara," came the captain's voice over the comm. "Remember, we're looking for signs of mining activity or artificial structures. The Raiders have to have a base somewhere in that field. Stay alert and watch each other's backs." As they entered the asteroid field, Marcus felt the familiar calm that came over him before battle. His scars seemed to tingle, reminding him of every fight he had survived, every enemy he had faced down. The other pilots saw those marks as signs of weakness. Marcus knew they were proof that he was still here, still fighting when stronger opponents had fallen. The asteroids drifted around them like sleeping giants, some as large as city blocks, others no bigger than cars. His scanner showed dozens of potential hiding spots, caves and crevices that could conceal ships or weapons platforms. "Contact!" called out one of the other pilots suddenly. "I'm reading energy signatures from asteroid cluster 77 Alpha." "Confirmed," came another voice. "Looks like weapons platforms, maybe 3 or 4 of them. All units, this is the captain. Approach with caution. Remember, we're looking for their main base, not just forward positions." Marcus checked his instruments and frowned. Something was wrong with the energy readings. The signatures were too clean, too uniform. Real Raider bases were usually cobbled together from salvaged parts and stolen equipment. They tended to have irregular power patterns and mixed technology. "Captain," he said into his comm, "those signatures look artificial to me. Too organized for a raider base." "What are you suggesting, human?" Vexen's voice carried clear irritation. "That we ignore obvious enemy positions?" "I'm suggesting they want us to see those positions," Marcus replied. "It's bait." Silence fell over the comm channel. Marcus could imagine the Zenthari officers exchanging glances, dismissing the warnings of the scarred human who clearly didn't understand proper military tactics. "Chen," Captain Zethara's voice was careful. "Explain your reasoning." "Raiders are scavengers," Marcus said, maneuvering his fighter between two slowly rotating asteroids. "They use whatever they can steal or salvage. Those energy signatures are too uniform. Too perfect. Someone set up those weapons platforms as a trap." "Ridiculous," Vexon snapped. "The human is trying to cover his cowardice with elaborate theories. I'm moving in to investigate." "Vexon, hold position," ordered the captain, but it was too late. The young Zenthari pilot was already accelerating toward the energy signatures, his sleek fighter cutting through space with typical Zenthari precision and confidence. His ship's shields shimmered as he approached the suspicious asteroids. Marcus watched his scanner as Vexon closed in on the target. Everything in him screamed that this was wrong, that they were walking into exactly the kind of trap humans had learned to recognize after generations of warfare. "Vexen," he called over the comm, "pull back. Something's not right." "I don't take orders from damaged humans," came the sharp reply. Marcus was about to respond when his scanner lit up like a festival display. Energy signatures were appearing all around them, dozens of them, as hidden raider ships powered up their weapons and engines. The asteroids themselves seemed to come alive as camouflaged weapons platforms revealed themselves. "It's a trap!" shouted one of the other pilots. The space around them erupted in weapons fire as the Void Raiders sprang their ambush. The carefully placed energy signatures hadn't been their main base at all. They had been bait to draw the Confederation squadron into a killing field surrounded by hidden enemies. Marcus threw his fighter into a hard turn as laser blasts filled the space where he had been seconds before. Around him, the other pilots were scattering, their perfect formation breaking apart under the sudden assault. Over the comm, he could hear panicked voices calling out positions and damage reports. The Raiders had planned this perfectly. They knew how the Zenthari fought, with precision and overwhelming force. But they had also known that the Zenthari's confidence in their superior technology would make them predictable. As Marcus rolled his fighter to avoid another barrage of enemy fire, he realized that this was exactly the kind of fight his people had been born for. Not the clean, technological warfare the Zenthari preferred, but the desperate, chaotic struggle where survival mattered more than tactics, and victory belonged to whoever refused to give up. The scars on his face seemed to burn as he pushed his fighter toward the nearest raider ship. It was time to show these aliens what humans had learned in their long climb from the mud to the stars. The real battle was just beginning. The space around Marcus exploded into chaos as the Void Raiders revealed themselves. Where moments before there had been empty asteroid fields, now dozens of enemy ships emerged from hidden positions. The Raiders had turned the entire sector into a killing field, with the Zenthari squadron caught right in the middle. Marcus rolled his fighter hard to starboard as a massive raider cruiser opened fire with its main guns. The energy beams passed close enough to his ship that he could feel the heat bleeding through his hull plating. Around him, the other pilots were breaking formation, their earlier confidence shattered by the sudden ambush. "This is impossible!" Vexen's voice crackled over the comm, high-pitched with panic. "There must be 50 ships out there. Intelligence said it was a small raider group." Intelligence was wrong, Marcus replied grimly, targeting the nearest enemy fighter. "Or the raiders wanted us to think they were small." Captain Zethara's voice cut through the chatter. "All units, fall back to Rally Point Delta. We're outnumbered 3-1. Repeat, fall back to..." Her transmission was cut off as the main ship took a direct hit from multiple raider vessels. Through his cockpit, Marcus could see the Harmony's shields flaring bright blue as they absorbed the punishment, but even Xanthari's shields had limits. "Captain's hit!" someone shouted. "Main ship is under heavy fire!" Marcus watched his tactical display as the situation went from bad to worse. The raiders weren't just random pirates. They were coordinated, professional, and they had planned this ambush perfectly. They knew exactly how Xanthari forces operated, how they thought, how they fought. A raider fighter swooped down on Marcus from above, its weapons blazing. Marcus didn't try to outrun it or outmaneuver it the way a Xanthari pilot would have. Instead, he did something that went against every principle of civilized space combat. He flew straight at the enemy ship. The raider pilot, expecting Marcus to turn away, fired where he predicted the human would go. But Marcus wasn't where the alien expected him to be. Instead, he was diving directly toward the enemy fighter, closing the distance at a rate that would have terrified any sane pilot. At the last possible second, Marcus rolled inverted and fired his main guns directly into the raider's belly. The enemy ship exploded in a ball of flame and debris. "Chen!" came Vexon's voice. "What are you doing? That was insane!" "That was effective," Marcus replied, already looking for his next target. On his scanner, he could see that the Xanthari pilots were trying to regroup, to establish some kind of defensive formation that would let their superior technology and training take effect. But the raiders weren't giving them that chance. They were pressing their attack from all angles, keeping the Confederation forces scattered and confused. Marcus realized that the raiders understood something the Xanthari didn't. Sometimes the key to victory wasn't being better than your enemy, but being more willing to take risks they wouldn't dare attempt. He opened a channel to all remaining fighters. "All units, this is Chen. Stop trying to regroup, stay scattered, and fight individually. Use the asteroids for cover and keep moving." "You're out of line, human," Vexon snapped back. "Xanthari combat doctrine clearly states—" "Xanthari combat doctrine is getting us killed," Marcus interrupted. "These raiders know how you fight. They're counting on you following protocol." Another explosion lit up the space nearby as one of the Xanthari fighters took a direct hit. The pilot managed to eject, but that still left them down to 6 operational fighters against impossible odds. Marcus dove toward a cluster of asteroids, weaving between the floating rocks as 3 raider ships pursued him. Behind him, he could hear the whine of their weapons, charging for another volley. Instead of trying to escape, Marcus suddenly cut his engines and let his ship drift behind a large asteroid. The raiders, moving at full speed, shot past his position. Marcus counted to 3, then fired his engines at full power and emerged from behind the rock with all weapons blazing. The first raider ship never knew what hit it. Marcus's concentrated fire punched through its rear armor and detonated its engine core. The second ship tried to turn, but Marcus was already inside its firing arc, too close for its weapons to track properly. The third raider managed to get off a shot that clipped Marcus's wing, sending his fighter spinning. Warning lights flashed on his console as systems failed one by one. His left engine was gone, his shields were down to 10%, and his life support was showing yellow warnings. But he was still flying, and the raider that had hit him was now directly in front of his guns. Marcus didn't hesitate. Even with his ship barely holding together, he pressed his attack. The raider pilot, probably assuming the damaged human ship was finished, tried to turn away to find easier prey. That moment of dismissal cost him his life as Marcus's remaining weapons found their mark. "Impossible," Vexon's voice came over the comm. "The human just destroyed 3 enemy ships. How is that possible with his primitive reflexes?" Marcus didn't bother to explain. He was already looking for his next target, scanning the battlefield for wherever he was needed most. Through the chaos, he could see that the Harmony was in serious trouble. The big ship was surrounded by raider vessels, its shields flickering dangerously low. "Captain," Marcus called out. "This is Chen. What's your status?" "Chen," came Zeth Ara's strained voice. We've lost main engines and our port weapons array. We're sitting ducks out here." "Not for long," Marcus replied, pushing his damaged fighter toward the main ship. "I'm coming to you." "Negative, Chen. Your ship is too damaged. Fall back with the other fighters." Marcus looked at his tactical display again. The other Zenthari pilots were finally starting to understand what he had been trying to tell them. Instead of fighting in formation, they were using the asteroids for cover, striking fast, and then disappearing before the raiders could coordinate their response. But it still wasn't enough. There were too many enemy ships, and the Harmony was too big a target to protect effectively. "Captain," Marcus said, "I need you to transfer all available power to your forward shields and prepare for emergency acceleration." "Chen, what are you planning?" Marcus was studying the raider formation around the main ship. They were positioned perfectly to prevent the Harmony from escaping, with overlapping fields of fire that would destroy the big ship if it tried to run. It was exactly the kind of tactical situation that Zenthari doctrine said was impossible to break without overwhelming force. But Marcus had grown up reading about human battles where impossible situations were exactly when heroes were born. "Captain, remember what you said about humans fighting differently?" "Chen, whatever you're thinking, just be ready to move when I give the word." Marcus turned his crippled fighter toward the largest raider ship, a massive cruiser that was coordinating the attack on the Harmony. His weapons were down to 30% power, his shields were gone, and his engines were threatening to shut down completely. He opened a channel to all the remaining Zenthari pilots. "This is Chen. When I start my attack run, I want everyone to hit the raiders from all sides at once. Don't worry about coordination or tactics. Just cause as much chaos as possible." "That's not how we fight," Vexen protested. "Today it is," Marcus replied. He pushed his fighter to maximum speed, aiming directly at the raider cruiser's command section. His scanners lit up as the big ship's weapons swiveled to target him, but Marcus was already committed. This was the kind of attack that only worked if you were completely willing to die for it. The raider captain clearly thought this was exactly what was happening, a desperate suicide run by a damaged human pilot. The cruiser's point defense weapons opened fire, filling the space around Marcus with deadly energy bursts. Marcus flew through the barrage like it was rain. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to find cover, to do anything except continue flying directly into certain death. But those instincts were human instincts, shaped by millions of years of evolution that taught his species to survive against impossible odds. At the last possible moment, Marcus activated his fighter's emergency self-destruct sequence and ejected from his ship. The raider captain, focused on the incoming fighter, never noticed the tiny escape pod that separated from the ship just before impact. Marcus's fighter slammed into the raider cruiser's bridge section and exploded with the force of a small nuclear weapon. The cruiser's command structure vaporized in an instant, its shields overloading and cascading failure rippling through its systems. The destruction of their flagship threw the raider formation into confusion. Without centralized command, individual raider ships began making independent decisions, breaking their coordinated attack pattern. "Now!" Marcus shouted into his emergency comm unit. "All units attack now!" The Zenthari pilots, finally understanding what Marcus had been trying to teach them, abandoned their careful formations and struck from all directions at once. Without their flagship to coordinate their response, the raiders found themselves fighting a dozen separate battles instead of one organized engagement. Vexian's fighter screamed down on a raider destroyer, his weapons blazing with newfound fury. "For the human!" he shouted, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching respect. The tide of battle began to turn. Raider ships, caught between the aggressive assault of the remaining fighters and the renewed fire from the Harmony, started to break off and retreat. Within minutes, what had been a coordinated ambush became a desperate flight for survival as the raiders abandoned their positions. Captain Zethara's voice came over the comm, strong and clear once again. All units, this is the captain. Pursue and destroy fleeing enemy vessels. Don't let them regroup. Marcus, drifting in his escape pod among the wreckage of the destroyed raider cruiser, watched as the Zenthari pilots pressed their attack with a ferocity he had never seen from their species before. They were fighting like humans now, not with perfect technique or superior technology, but with the kind of desperate courage that turned defeats into victories. A rescue shuttle from the Harmony found Marcus's pod an hour later, after the last raider ship had been either destroyed or driven from the system. As he was brought aboard, Marcus could see the damage his escape pod had taken from flying through the explosion. Burns and scorch marks covered its hull, and several systems had failed completely. When he finally made it to the shuttle's small medical bay, the Zenthari medic who examined him stopped short when she saw his face. The explosion had torn open his old scars, leaving fresh wounds that would heal into new patterns of damaged tissue. "Human," she said softly. "Your face." Marcus touched his cheek and felt the wetness of fresh blood. When this healed, he would have even more scars to add to his collection, more marks that would make the aliens whisper about human weakness and primitive fighting methods. "It's fine," he said. "They're just scars." But as the shuttle carried him back to the Harmony, 3 days after the battle at Keth Val, Marcus found himself standing in the main briefing room aboard the Harmony, surrounded by representatives from 12 different species of the Galactic Confederation. The fresh wounds on his face had been treated, but they were still visible, red lines that would soon become new scars to add to his collection. Admiral Thexor of the Confederation High Command had arrived via quantum relay just hours after receiving Captain Zethara's report. The tall, crystalline being's presence filled the room with a low humming sound as his internal energy matrix processed the implications of what had occurred. "Lieutenant Commander Chen," the Admiral said, his voice resonating like distant thunder. "Your actions during the engagement have raised questions about current tactical doctrine." Marcus stood at attention, acutely aware that every eye in the room was focused on his scarred face. Representatives from the sleek Zenthari, the insectoid Vorthak, the energy-based Lumari, and half a dozen other species were all studying him like he was some kind of exotic specimen. "Questions, sir?" Marcus asked. "The destruction of 43 enemy vessels with minimal losses is unprecedented," Admiral Thexor continued. "Captain Zethara reports that you achieved this victory by deliberately abandoning established combat protocols." Commander Vexen, who was standing with the other Zenthari officers, stepped forward. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by something Marcus had never expected to see in a Zenthari: uncertainty. "Admiral," Vexen said, "I must report that the humans' tactics were unorthodox." He ignored proper formation flying, engaged in what could only be described as reckless behavior, and ultimately destroyed his own ship in a suicide attack. "A suicide attack that worked," Captain Zethara interjected quietly, "and saved all our lives." The room fell silent as the various species processed this information. For most of the Confederation races, the idea of deliberately sacrificing equipment or accepting personal risk for tactical advantage was completely foreign. Their advanced technology had made warfare a matter of superior firepower and defensive capabilities. Admiral Thexor's crystalline features shifted as he accessed data files. "According to the reports, you suffered significant damage to your vessel early in the engagement, yet you continued to fight. Most pilots would have withdrawn for repairs." Marcus thought about how to explain something that seemed obvious to him, but clearly wasn't to these aliens. "Sir, the mission wasn't complete. My ship was damaged but functional. Withdrawing would have left my squad mates outnumbered." "But you were injured," interjected Commander Itek of the Vorthak contingent, her multifaceted eyes clicking as they focused on his scars. Your biological systems were compromised. Logic dictates self-preservation should have taken priority. No, ma'am, Marcus replied. Logic dictates that completing the mission takes priority. Personal safety is secondary. The assembled officers exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of thinking that made humans so difficult for the other species to understand. Every other race in the Confederation had achieved spaceflight through careful advancement, methodical progress, and the minimization of risk. They fought wars with overwhelming technological advantages and withdrew when losses became unacceptable. Humans, apparently, did things differently. Lieutenant Commander, Admiral Thexor said, "We have reviewed the tactical recordings of the engagement. Your fellow pilots report that you advised them to abandon formation fighting and engage in individual combat. This goes against millennia of proven military doctrine." Marcus looked around the room at the alien faces staring back at him. How could he explain to them that sometimes the proven way wasn't the right way? That sometimes survival meant being willing to do things that logic said were impossible? "Sir," he began carefully, "formation fighting works when you have technological superiority and adequate numbers. When you're outnumbered and outgunned, sometimes you need to make the enemy fight your kind of fight instead of theirs." "Your kind of fight?" Yathek's compound eyes clicked again. "What do you mean by this?" Marcus touched the fresh wounds on his face unconsciously. "Messy, personal, the kind of fight where winning matters more than looking good doing it." The truth was starting to dawn on some of the assembled officers. For all their advanced technology and sophisticated tactics, most Confederation races had never faced the kind of desperate, do-or-die combat that had shaped human civilization. They fought clean wars with clear objectives and acceptable casualty rates. "Admiral," Captain Zethara said, "I believe the human is suggesting that there are tactical situations where conventional doctrine is inadequate. The raiders at Kethval had clearly studied our standard response patterns. They knew exactly how we would react. But they didn't know how humans would react," Marcus added quietly. Admiral Thexor was quiet for a long moment, his internal energy matrix humming at a different frequency as he processed this information. When he finally spoke, his voice carried new weight. "The Void Raiders have been using similar tactics throughout the Outer Rim. Intelligence reports suggest they have successfully ambushed 17 Confederation patrols in the last 6 months. In every case, our forces were caught in prepared killing fields and forced to withdraw with significant losses." The implications hung in the air like smoke. The raiders weren't just random pirates. They were a coordinated force that had learned to exploit the Confederation's predictable tactical responses. "Sir," Marcus said, "if I may suggest something?" Every alien in the room turned to look at him. He could feel their skepticism, their doubt that this scarred human could offer insights that their advanced civilizations had missed. "The raiders succeed because they know how we fight. They set traps based on our doctrine, our training, our technology, but if we start fighting differently, if we become unpredictable, their advantages disappear." Commander Vexon, who had been silent since his initial report, suddenly spoke up. "During the battle, when the human ordered us to abandon formation, it felt wrong. Everything in our training said we should regroup and establish defensive positions, but the raiders couldn't coordinate their response when we scattered. They had planned for us to fight like Zenthari. They weren't prepared for us to fight like humans," Marcus finished. Admiral Thexor's crystalline form pulsed with brighter light as he came to a decision. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, you will prepare a full tactical analysis of the Kethval engagement. I want detailed recommendations for modified combat doctrine that incorporates these human methods." Marcus felt a strange sensation in his chest, something between pride and disbelief. "Sir, you want me to teach Confederation forces to fight like humans?" "I want you to teach us to win," the Admiral replied. The Void Raiders have been successful because they understand how we think, how we fight. You have shown that there are alternatives to conventional tactics. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself in the surreal position of lecturing rooms full of alien officers on human military history. He talked about the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off thousands. He explained the tactics used at the siege of Stalingrad, where humans fought for months in the ruins of their own city. He described the desperate last stands and impossible victories that had shaped his species throughout history. The aliens listened with a mixture of fascination and horror. The idea of deliberately accepting casualties to achieve objectives was foreign to them. The concept of fighting on even when victory seemed impossible went against every instinct their civilizations had developed. But they learned. Commander Vexon proved to be one of the most eager students. The young Zenthari officer threw himself into studying human tactical methods with the same intensity he had once devoted to traditional doctrine. Within a month, he was leading training exercises that would have been considered reckless insanity by previous Confederation standards. "I begin to understand," Vexon told Marcus after one particularly chaotic training simulation. "We have been fighting to minimize losses. Humans fight to maximize impact." Marcus nodded. "Sometimes accepting small losses prevents bigger ones. Sometimes the only way to save lives is to risk them." The true test came when Admiral Thexor assigned Marcus to lead a mixed-species task force against another Void Raider stronghold. Intelligence had located a major base in the Zerion Nebula, where the Raiders had been building up forces for a massive offensive against Confederation supply lines. As Marcus stood on the bridge of his new command ship, the fast cruiser Defiance, he found himself looking at a crew that would have been unthinkable just months before. Zenthari pilots trained in aggressive tactics, Vorthak gunners who had learned to prioritize targets based on battlefield impact rather than technical specifications, Lumari engineers who had modified their ships for maximum maneuverability instead of maximum protection. "All units. This is Admiral Chen," he said into the comm system, still not quite used to his new rank. "Remember what we've learned. The Raiders will expect us to fight like the old Confederation. Today we show them what the new Confederation can do." The battle in the Zerion Nebula lasted 18 hours and became known as the first major victory against the Void Raiders in over a year. Marcus's forces used every lesson learned at Kethvale, hitting the Raider base from multiple directions while avoiding the prepared killing fields that had trapped so many previous expeditions. When it was over, the Raiders' main fleet had been shattered, their base destroyed, and their coordinated threat to Confederation space permanently ended. Standing in his quarters afterward, Marcus looked at himself in the mirror. The latest battle had added new marks to his collection, a thin line across his forehead where shrapnel had found its way past his helmet, burns on his hands from damaged control panels, the kinds of injuries that came from fighting at close quarters instead of at safe distances. The door chimed, and Captain Zethara entered. She had been promoted as well, and now served as Marcus's second in command. "The reports are in," she said. "Confederation Command wants you to establish a new tactical school. They're calling it the Human Combat Studies Institute." Marcus almost laughed. "They want me to teach an entire school of alien officers to fight like humans?" "They want you to teach them to win," Zethara corrected. "The old ways worked when we faced enemies who fought by the same rules. But the galaxy is changing, Marcus. There are threats out there that won't be impressed by our technology or our breeding or our perfect formations." She paused, looking at his scarred reflection in the mirror. "I used to think those marks on your face were signs of failure. Now I understand they're proof of survival. Every scar represents a battle you lived through, a moment when you chose to keep fighting instead of giving up." Marcus nodded slowly. "Every species in the Confederation achieved spaceflight by being better than their challenges. Humans achieved it by being too stubborn to quit." "And that," Zethara said, is exactly what we need to learn. Months later, when the first graduating class of the Human Combat Studies Institute received their commissions, Marcus stood before them and saw something that would have been impossible before Kethvale. Zenthari officers who had learned to value courage over perfection. Vorthak commanders who understood that sometimes the logical choice was to do something illogical. Representatives from a dozen species who had absorbed the central lesson of human warfare, that victory belongs not to the strongest or the smartest, but to those who refuse to surrender. As he looked out at their faces, Marcus realized that his scars had become something more than personal reminders. They had become symbols of a new kind of warrior, one who measured success not by avoiding damage, but by accomplishing the mission. The aliens had mocked his scars, seeing them as proof of human weakness. Now those same marks had become the foundation of a new military doctrine that was spreading throughout Confederation space. Marcus Chen had walked into history not despite his wounds, but because of what they represented. The unbreakable human spirit that turned defeats into victories and made heroes out of those who refused to quit. In the end, the scars had told the truth after all. They weren't marks of failure. They were proof that humans never stopped fighting. Sius knew that something had changed. The Zenthari who had rescued him weren't looking at his wounds with disgust anymore. Instead, their large violet eyes held something that looked almost like awe. The battle was over, but Marcus suspected that the real test was still to come. Word of what had happened here would spread throughout the Confederation, carried by the surviving pilots who had seen a damaged human fighter destroy a raider cruiser through sheer force of will. For the first time since joining the Confederation forces, Marcus wondered if maybe the other species might start to understand what those scars really meant.